Welcome to Lecture 8 of my course on climate science, discussion for everyone. I am going to follow up with our discussion about is it warming and why is it warming. By now, hopefully you're thinking that we may have a problem, or you may have decided we don't have a problem, in which case what comes next may not be as important for you. But if you have decided we have an issue we need to think about, what comes next is what are we worried about, given that we believe that fossil fuel burning is causing more greenhouse gases. That and other things are causing more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, leading to temperature changes. So we're going to proceed to talking about what we're worried about. So if I can get this set up, there we go. The way I've got this organized, we're going to talk a little bit first about predicting future temperature and what it means. And then we're going to get into the kinds of things that might possibly happen, or we predict will happen, or to some extent are already happening. So let's begin by first looking at predicting future climate. By the way, that picture is the Swiss Alps in 1989. The blue is an enhanced way to look at the Lanta Glacier in 1989, and this is the Lanta Glacier in 2017. This is one of the glaciers that's in that reference glacier slide that we looked at earlier in one of the sections of the course. So the question is, one of the most important questions is, how long will it be until it gets to certain temperatures? And the reason it would be handy for us to know that, because if we want to think about what we're worried about, time is very important. If this were to happen slowly enough, we might imagine that for a long time, hundreds of years, we might be able to adapt, right? For example, people will move from, if sea level rises, people will move from low-lying places, hopefully. If the economy is strong, we might be able to absorb costs associated with those movements. We could strengthen various structures or move various things. Today, we have chemical plants close to sea level. We have power plants, sanitation facilities. These things might need to be moved, but if we had enough time and enough money, we could do that. Agricultural centers where a lot of our food is grown could develop, we could develop new crops, new methods. We could move the Corn Belt to slightly different areas depending on there are limits on that based on the nature of the soil, but there are things we could do. So basically, also, if we have more time, we have technology development that could happen. For example, the time might be used switching to a more renewables mix of energy sources, and new technologies in energy generation and so on that would remove a lot of the carbon from the production process. And also, our ecosystems might have time to adapt. As we said earlier, though, the temperature change with time seen so far, a couple degrees Fahrenheit in maybe 100 years, is a lot faster than past geologic changes in our climate history. And so that's a worry because plants and animals, even in the past, have not adjusted well to some of this change. So this rather rapid change could be a problem for them. So anyways, that's the importance of this question, how long until how hot? And if you want to predict the future temperature, what's needed is a whole bunch of variables that you're going to have to guess at. So here's a sample. For example, energy production goes up with GDP growth. However, energy intensity, the amount of energy used to generate a GDP dollar, that's one way to think about energy intensity, um, has been fairly flat for the United States for the last 15 years or so. So the combination of those two factors is something that one might have to guess at. The population growth is a factor. The more people there are, the more energy we use, and along with population growth is the degree, the prosperity of people living and what their energy use might be. Land use, how are we changing the surface of the earth from an albedo perspective, from how reflective it is, as well as what we're using it for. And, agriculture is an important part of this question. And many of those things lead to predictions of emissions of greenhouse gases. That's what the GHG is. For CO2, CH4 is methane, nitrous oxide, and so on. And of course, once you have emissions, you can then ask the question, what are the CO2, what are the concentrations in the atmosphere? If we change our energy mix, the fuels we use to generate energy, we will change those concentrations. What are the pollutants that we're going to be putting in the atmosphere, the aerosols? Of course, there are a lot of natural aerosols, but there's also the ones that we generate in industry as well as in producing energy. And then, of course, you would like to have some map of these by country so that you could use regional models to influence the circulation of these things. So what's been done, this next graph shows various scenarios. They're labeled. Let me put my glasses on here so I can read better. These are labeled RCPs. They're representative emissions pathways. And the idea behind these is that you have various groups of folks, experts about the economy and so on and so forth, that have gotten together in the past. And you want to think of each of these as like a scenario. On the graph on the left, the one labeled RCP 8.5 is sort of doing what we're doing with some assumptions that in the future we figure out how to become more efficient about energy production, and solar and wind and that kind of stuff. And gradually, so there's a rather steep increase until 2050 and a bit of a leveling off. And then the other ones, all the way down to RCP 6, 4.5, and 2.6. The number at the end is the watts per square meter imbalance at the top of the atmosphere at 2100. So what that says is, at RCP 8.5, you will have a rather large watts per square meter imbalance in 2100 of 8.5 watts per square meter, whereas the RCP 2.6 is a lot smaller, obviously. Now, these scenarios, this is the graph on the left is emissions in gigaton, and it should say CO2 equivalent rather than just CO2, by year from 2000 to 2100. To clarify, the y-axis is in gigatons of carbon. And so one of the confusions you'll find later on, even previously, we have talked about gigatons of CO2. Some of these graphs go back and forth. So when you see gigatons of carbon, to get to gigatons of CO2, you have to multiply by 3.7 or so, because the carbon atom is 12 grams per mole, and CO2, the whole molecule, is 44 grams per mole. Also, at the top of this graph, it says CO2. It should say CO2 equivalent, because we're talking about all the greenhouse gases that are estimated in this scenario. The graph on the right is the CO2 concentration in parts per million. As we said today, as we sit at 2020, we are about 400, right? And so you sort of see we're on the blue curve, right? The curves are fairly close together until you get out to 2025 or so. Probably the most interesting thing about this is that the concentrations in the atmosphere on the right don't ever go down, even though the green one does a little bit. Don't ever go down, even though the emissions do go down. So notice the red or black curve, emissions drop off around 2050 under various assumptions, 2040 for the red curve, let's say. And yet the concentration goes up or stays the same. That's because we said we're putting carbon into a tank, and so with a very small hole in the bottom. And as we talked about that in the previous talk, and because there's no that nature doesn't take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere easily, right? Now, the green curve, where it actually shows a drop off, assumes that around 2050, we learn to do negative emission technologies that basically remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequester the carbon someplace, like in an underground formation or something like that. So that's one assumption. So in summary, what we have here is we have 4 representative pathways. They span a range of possibilities, from being very optimistic at 2.6, which is probably not possible anymore given where we are, but you might hope we could catch up, all the way to what you might call business as usual. In other words, we kind of ignore the problem and just do what we're doing. The middle 2 scenarios, the black and the red, assume that we have emission peaks in about 2050 and 2060, with reductions in emissions after that. The fossil fuel, in this case, supplies maybe 90% of the CO2 emissions till you get to, 2025, 2030. And other greenhouse gases concentrations are estimated by all these scenarios. So these scenarios are put together by folks who are saying, this is what we think people might do in the future. Let's use these as references to figure out how to predict what the temperature might be like under various choices we might make as human beings, right? And obviously these are choices individuals make, governments make. This is the whole range of possibilities. Now you can argue about any of these to a great extent. There's a lot of uncertainty here, but clearly it represents a range that we can learn from. That's the idea. Okay, so now let's look at the temperature prediction for these 4 scenarios from now till 2150, okay? That's a long ways off. So really we should be looking probably till 2100 at the farthest, and maybe even 2050, because lots of things will happen in the world between now and 2150. But this is done, as the slide says, with 2 degrees sensitivity. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that we're saying that if you double CO2, you get a 2-degree change in temperature. I mentioned to you that sensitivity, climate sensitivity, if you look at the big global circulation models, estimate a range from something like 1.85 all the way to 4 or something, right? So I've chosen, and I made this graph, I've chosen a number around 2 degrees per doubling of CO2 in order to, CO2 equivalent, in order to pick a optimistic range for the temperatures, right? So you can see for RCP 8.5, which is now the purple curve, I apologize for the change in color, you cross 2 degrees around 2050. The green is around maybe 2075. The red is 2100. And the blue curve on the bottom, which which is the lowest RCP, doesn't get there until, doesn't get at all to 2 degrees. Now, that curve, like I said, is going to be very, very difficult for us to get to. We've almost put enough carbon in the tank to kind of eliminate the possibility we could stay on that curve. The line for 2 degrees is kind of the blue line. It's a little below 2 degrees there. And that line, that two degree goal is chosen somewhat arbitrarily, but has been chosen by various climate summits like Copenhagen and Paris, as well as used in all the IPCC reports. And the idea of the 2 degree goal is that it's a place where scientists believe we could adapt. It will be expensive, but we could adapt, and we might be able to avoid what are called tipping points. And we'll get to tipping points later, but tipping points are, we're assuming these temperature curves are fairly smoothly varying, but there may be, we may be living in a climate system that actually has some place you get to in terms of concentrations of greenhouse gases or some other combination of variables, reduction of albedo because the cryosphere is melting and so on, that could create a rather large change in temperature quickly. That's called a tipping point. And so that's one of the concerns. And the idea is if we stay below 2 degrees, hopefully we won't run into one of those is the idea. So this is the 3 degree sensitivity. And you'll notice that at the 3 degree sensitivity, we cross the 2 degree range, 2 degree temperature a lot sooner. Somewhere it's like 2040 for the purple curve, the RCP 8.5. And people today would tell you that the climate sensitivity is somewhere between, probably if you were taking bets, you would say it's somewhere between 2 and 3, maybe closer to 3 than 2. And so the answer, the prediction might lie somewhere between these 2 curves. Now, of course, all that is subject to the accuracy of the kind of models that we've talked about, which are indeed quite complicated. But they're our best knowledge at the moment, okay? Now, this next graph looks at climate in a different way. So let's say, you know, when we talk about the climate of a city like Boston, let's pick Boston as an example, Boston, Massachusetts. We would say Boston is a humid continental climate with warm summers and cold, snowy winters, right? If we were more precise, we would give the monthly average temperatures, let's say for the last 30 years, and we would give the monthly precipitation for the last 30 years, or we could even for the last 30 years put daily quantities together. And we could do a distribution. In other words, if you look at the curve on the left, we could say the frequency of occurrence, and the bottom scale could be temperature. So bins, so, you know, from 30 degrees to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 to 40, 40 to 45. And then in each of those bins, we could say, how many times did that happen in the last 30 years? And you, for, you know, the daily average temperature. And you could make up that distribution. And you would say, well, it's extremely unlikely in Boston to have a temperature like minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Just doesn't happen very much. It's an extreme event on the cold side. The same thing on the hot side. You would say it's extremely unlikely in Boston to have a temperature like 108 degrees Fahrenheit. You might have that in Phoenix, but you don't have that in Boston very often at all. You'd melt those Bostonians at that temperature, right? The idea is that curve, that distribution is composed of a representative set of samples over a sufficient period of time to determine the climate. And likely events lie in the middle. What's the average temperature in Boston? Now, you could even do this by month to make the distribution more narrow and more predictive. So you could say the same thing for the month of January in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, if you looked at that, you could say, what happens if the average temperature goes up? Well, what happens if the average temperature goes up is you just shift that curve to the right. And over on the right there, we call that the new normal, the distribution. Now, it's possible the distribution would change width. In other words, it's possible that you might get more variation or less. I think it's unlikely you would get less because you're putting more energy in the atmosphere. You might assume that you get more variation, which is what we kind of expect. But let's just stay with shifting the mean. So the idea is we're shifting the mean. The new normal is on average warmer. What that says is the low temperature events become less likely, and now the low frequency events on the cold side are at a higher temperature, another way of saying the same thing. And the high temperature events you used to think of as less likely are now more likely. So if you had an event that was like the 108 degrees, maybe in 100 years, Boston would have one day in July of 108 degrees. But now the probability goes up that once in 100 years event might end up being 5 times in 100 years or 100 or 10 times in 100 years, right? Because you're shifting the curve to the right. Any sample out of here of one-day temperature is, of course, the weather. So in thinking about this, the climate is the distribution, the weather is a sample out of the distribution. Now, this distribution could be for temperature, but it could also be for precipitation, right? This could be a curve of the amount of rainfall in a day in Boston in a month, in a particular month, for the last 30 years, right? You could do such a distribution and look at likely and unlikely events. Okay, so you might say, well, can we see this in historical data? So this is from a publication by Goddard Space Flight Center. This is for summer temperature anomalies in the Northern Hemisphere, over land. And basically it looks at a distribution like what we were talking about. The period to the left is 30 years from 1950 to 1980. And then in 30-year increments all the way to 2001 to, I guess we've shifted there by different amounts, but from 2000, the last one to the right is 2001 to 2011, which is 10 years, right? So if you look back in time, this is set at an average temperature, which is referenced to 0. So there are anomalies relative to the temperature back in that period in 51 to 1980. And you can see that since then, this curve, this distribution of temperatures has been moving to the right, right? And what it says is, it actually looks like it's broader too. The distribution is somewhat broader. And that's difficult to be sure about. We don't know if that's real. We believe the average temperature has shifted. The problem with putting this together for the Northern Hemisphere is you're looking over quite a region of space, and so there might be regional effects here that we're not canceling out carefully enough. But the idea is the colors represent the likelihoods, right? So basically the red of 1951 to 1980 is the likelihood of those events, and that moves, as you can see, there are more and more of those red events as you move to the right. So we're going to get more days like that. There are less blue days, right? Because that amount of blue days that happened back in 51 to 80, the number in that range has gone down substantially after you shift the curve out, right? So, and there are more extreme events that have shown up, the brown, right? Just what I said before. So there is some real data that suggests this kind of thing is going on. Now, what this does is it gives us some tools to look at predicting changes in the climate. So we can do this. We can look at historical distributions over years of both temperature and precipitation, and then we can predict into the future, like if we keep moving temperature, what's the likelihood of more extreme temperatures or more extreme rainfall or something like that. We can take the newest. We can also do that for precipitation. We can also look at the prediction on actual weather events. So we can say, if you have a hurricane, like Hurricane Michael, which hit here in 2018 in Florida, right near where I live in Tallahassee, or a little further south and west, where it did most of the damage. We can say Michael came ashore, became a 5 in strength, just as it hit shore. It was a 4 just offshore. It strengthened very quickly. And the question is, what would Michael have been if we had gone back to, let's say, the 1950s or 60s or 70s, right? Well, the parameter we can change is we can change the surface temperature of the Gulf of Mexico from what it was when Michael did come ashore to what it was in 1970, let's say. And we can change the amount of moisture in the air, because we saw earlier in an earlier lecture that the amount of moisture in the air is more these days than then. And we can adjust parameters to what the situation was back then, use the same hurricane model that predicted Michael's path and strength, and see what it would have been, right? Once we show that the model actually confirms what Michael did. And Michael ends up then being a strong level 3 type hurricane, right? You can do this for other historical heat waves and other things, and these are called attribution studies of climate. So we have various tools using this distribution analysis. We have various tools that we can use to try and predict what might happen as we go forward. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to those predictions, right? And each of these are going to be pretty bold statements, right? So I want to give you the caveat that these are complex physical ideas, and we are looking at these from the perspective of these are the ones that we're pretty certain will happen. And some of the reason that we're fairly confident about these predictions is because there are already signs that they are happening, right? So I'm going to walk through these with you, and then we'll show evidence of each of these, talk about each of these with some evidence and motivate them. So the first one is that will surely happen is it's going to get hot, especially at the equator. Even though the Earth is warming more dramatically at the poles, we still know that southern parts of the northern hemisphere and northern parts of the southern hemisphere are going to get hotter near the equator. So a lot more people will live in cities exposed to very high summer temperatures. We believe global sea level will continue to rise. We will have what's called chronic inundation, and we're going to explain that. That's basically saying you will have a lot of water coming into fairly populated towns and cities in coastal areas that basically just due to tides. But if there are storms and rainfall, either storm surge from hurricanes or rainfall, you will have a lot more damage from flooding. And we expect by 2100 global mean sea level rise of at least 2 feet and up to 4 feet by that time. Wildfires will consume more land area due to dry, hot summer conditions, and also by extending the season, right? So we've already extended the warm, dry season by a couple of weeks in California and in Australia and so on. Agricultural regions will have to adjust to temperatures. Increased temperature in agricultural regions does have various effects on germination, pollination, fruit setting, as well as crop yields. And some of these things are positive and some are negative, but there will be changes that we'll have that we'll have to adapt to. There will be more extreme weather events. In fact, we have evidence that that's already happening. In particular, we have a lot more rainfall, droughts, hurricanes. Whether there'll be more or less is debatable, more or less number, but when we get them, we expect some of them to be more intense, like Hurricane Michael. Animals and plants will shift habitat ranges, behaviors. For example, some insects and birds are basically breeding more than once a season because of the length of the season. And as a result of those range changes, we expect increased exposure, more increased human exposure to vector-borne diseases. In fact, it's likely that's already happening. And finally, coral reefs, which supply a lot of protein for people fishing and so on and so forth. And the industry is worth a fair bit of money. Will be a very rare ecosystem in 20 to 50 years. There are many reasons we damage coral, but warming seas and more acidic seas are a real problem for coral. So we're going to talk through these. And the first one we're going to talk about is this prediction of temperature effects. So we're going to take a measurement that is, I'll refer you back to the slide that showed the shifting distribution of North American summer temperatures. We're going to talk about the average maximum daily temperature for 3 consecutive summer months. So if you take the maximum daily temperature every day and you average it, if for the three consecutive summer months, and here we've taken June, July, and August, if that's over 95 degrees, we say, okay, that city, wherever it is, has experienced that, right? Today, the dots represent cities that experience that today. And if you look at those dots, you'll recognize they're, along the equator or in various places where you might expect them. The size of the dot represents the population in this area, and this in each of those dots. And this is from data from 1980 to 2005. So this is historical data over that 25-year period. This is from a report at c40.org. Now, if you just assume my 2 degrees, I think they use 2 degrees sensitivity, but if you assume an increase in temperature expected by 2050, so this is by 2050, you can see the increase in the cities that will experience that, right? I should go back and say, you'll notice that, for example, Phoenix experiences this today. That's, I believe, the green dot. I think that's Phoenix. It might be, I don't know, maybe it might be El Paso. I've got that wrong. It might be Phoenix further out there. So we have cities that do that. You see Mumbai in India that does that today. But look at the number of cities that will have that experience in the future. And the population, today there are something like, I think, somewhere around 250, I don't see it on my slide here, but maybe 250 million people who are exposed to those kind of summer temperatures today. If this happened by 2050, it would be 1.6 billion people who would be exposed to those kind of summer temperatures, which is a very large increase. So what kind of results would you expect from that? Well, when you get high temperatures like that, there is an effect on human health. The average American would see 25 to 50 days above 95 degrees each year. That's averaged over a large range of temperature. But cities will be hit the hardest, and our cities aren't well designed for high temperature. We have buildings close together. We don't have good circulation. We have a lot of hardscape, which is very absorbent and re-radiates infrared energy. There are a lot of reasons why our cities are not well designed for this. We need more plants, we need more absorptive surfaces, we need more water and so on to try and make them less prone to difficult to live in, anyways, less difficult to live in. There will be several days per year above the human heat stroke index. This is basically a temperature humidity combination where you can't really go outside for more than so many minutes because, let's say half an hour, because your body simply cannot cool itself in that, and still operate. So numbers like 95 degrees and above 70% humidity get you into this range. I don't have the exact number, but if you look, there are tables of the human heat stroke index. We expect labor productivity to go down. I mean, you can imagine agricultural workers, construction workers, landscaping, anybody working outside, spending time outside, driving a bus or whatever, without air conditioning, you got a problem, right? It's going to be hard to be outside for very long. Demand for air conditioning will require new energy investments in generation and transmission, and being more U.S.-centric. That will happen in the south and southwest of the U.S., maybe even in the southeast, where we already have quite a bit of air conditioning. Some folks point out that, although this isn't all about energy consumption, some folks point out that we'll use less energy in the north, where it's colder, and presumably we'll have warmer winters. While that's true, it doesn't change this prediction, number one. And number two, it isn't, these, again, we go back to the time to adjust to these things. It isn't easy to move power plants and other kinds of things. If we need more air conditioning, it has to be installed. So even though you may not run your heater as much in upstate New York, you're going to have to put in a new air conditioner in Mobile, Alabama, or a whole bunch of new ones to take this into account. So it will be expensive, and there will be a threat to us in terms of working outside, even living outside in some of our cities. This gets in, the next graph points out that mean sea level rise is going up. This is a graph which I've shown before with the tidal gauges in orange and the satellite measurements, the altimeter satellite measurements in yellow. We talked about this before, that the average rise is about 3 millimeters per year for the last 20 or 30 years. However, that number, we believe that number is accelerating by 0.08 millimeters per year. So this is where we get the 2 to 4 feet change in sea level by 2100. And there is some evidence, which we'll talk about later, that that may even be an underestimate, the 4 feet. And I will quickly point out that where you are on the coast really matters to how much this affects you, because some coastal areas are subsiding. That is, not only is the ocean going up, but the land is going down, whereas others are staying the same or maybe even going up. So as we know, Venice is sinking, right? Meantime, the ocean is going up. That's a bad combination. The eastern seaboard of the United States is subsiding as well. And in fact, that leads to this next study. Let me do this next study first, and we'll go back and look at what I just bounced past. You missed that slide. Don't pay attention to that slide. So here is a study of what's called chronic inundation. The definition of inundation is that you have at least 26 floods per year, over 10% of the area of the community. These communities are counties. These are county boundaries. The colored things are counties. Some of them are summed together, so there are multiple counties in one of these blocks. But today, that criteria of chronic inundation in the United States, Annapolis, Maryland has 24 basically floods a year. Charleston has 50 a year. And Miami Beach has a little less than 20, so they wouldn't quite qualify. But as you probably read, Miami Beach is spending something like $500 million on pumps, seawalls, and raising streets and so on because of the effect of this. And in you can get this flooding just from tidal effects. There are things called the king tides, where the sun and the earth and the moon line up in such a fashion that the tide is larger than a regular tide that the moon causes. And what you see in the graphic here is by the colors are by years that will be affected by this. So in present, the yellow is already regions that are chronically inundated. Again, over 26 floods a year, and 10% of the surface area of those counties are flooded. You can see down in the Florida Keys, we have some of that. And over in the Louisiana area, we have some of that, in the Chesapeake Bay area. This is by 2050. So you can see, I'm sorry, this is, yellow is present. If you use the magenta, it's 2100. You can see that land is, the amount, the area affected is much bigger. Blue is 2035, and green is by 2060. And that's assuming that we're right about the amount of sea level rise. We're using the 0.03, the 3 millimeters per year, and the 0.08 acceleration. And let me just backtrack to that slide that I flashed through that you weren't supposed to see yet. This is just saying that in the future, what we need to be aware of is that acceleration is coming from increasing Greenland and Antarctica ice loss. And this is a study that was done fairly recently. It was reported in Scientific American in 2019. It shows in the graph on the right the gigatons per year of lost ice. And you'll notice the bar gets bigger, so that in the 2009 to 2017 period, we lost 250 gigatons of Antarctic ice loss, whereas in 1979 to 1990, we lost less than 50. Now, this is ice loss from glaciers, not sea ice. Sea ice, when it melts, does not affect sea level rise, but ice that's sitting on land does affect sea level rise. And so this is just a warning that those measurements we're making could be changing. So the acceleration, I'll say this in a confusing way, the acceleration could be accelerating, right? And that could mean we have even more loss. In fact, I think I had a number here, something like there's an awful lot, I think it's $1.8 billion worth of real estate could be affected by this chronic inundation by 2100. But even before then, real estate values could be affected. Okay, so let's move to wildfires. Another effect of higher temperatures and longer summer weather is wildfires. This is a mid-century picture of annual acres burned. And this is, again, business as usual. Temperature goes up by a couple degrees by, let's say, 2060 or something. And you can see that West Texas has a lot of burning. Even up in North Dakota and out on the west in the Washington area, you get burning. So a fair bit of increase in wildfires. This is being recorded in 2020, and we've had Australia just had a horrible season of wildfires in Australia. Now, what's driving this? Well, what we seem to be seeing is heavier spring rains because we have more moisture in the snow. We get heavier snows, heavier spring rains, which sounds great because, especially in California, because we need to build up the reservoirs there. They had been going through drought for a long time. But when you get those spring rains and stuff, you get an increase in vegetation, of course. More plants grow to higher heights and so on. Then we get these dry, hot summers. And the other thing that's happened is these summers are extended for longer periods of time. Now, how the fires start are often related to us as humans. The California fires recently were started with some electrical problems in the power grid. Humans start fires. There's even arson in some cases. And also we have the problem that more and more people live in the woods, and we have more expensive homes in the woods, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of homes in places they probably shouldn't be. But bottom line, climate change has contributed dramatically to this. This is for a 1.8 degree change in climate, which we're predicting sort of mid-century kind of effect, right? Okay. How about extreme precipitation events? This is real data. On the left is an increase in the heaviest precipitation events, and you notice the Northeast has the largest increase. But the graph on the right is for the whole US, and it shows annual days that have more than 1 inch of rainfall compared to the average, right? From 1950 to 2017. And basically, we show that increasing fairly dramatically. So what we're seeing is, a lot more rain. And if we take a climate model and use a standard distribution for the last 30 years, we can actually calculate the precipitation events predicted in 2050 and ask how different they are. Regional differences in latitude, position of various water bodies, and so on make it more difficult to make a specific regional picture. But in large chunks of the country, we can say we expect to have more heavy precipitation events that will lead to flooding of various sorts. For example, the Great Lakes Basin, which goes from Lake Superior all the way through the Great Lakes to, drains all the way through the Great Lakes, connected by rivers and canals, all the way out through the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic Ocean. Because of the increased rainfall there since about 2015, those lakes have been well above their normal levels. So in Lake Ontario, where I have a house on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, we've had a lot of damage, erosion. Imagine you raise the lake by a foot or two, which is what it's been, and then you get a big windstorm coming along with 4 or 5 foot waves crashing on your shore. You lose ground. So we've had $100 million worth of damage in 2017 to the shore. The state of New York has tried to correct some of that in public areas, as well as provide some money for private people, and a lot of erosion of private property because of increased rainfall. You can do these same curves for 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch annual rainfall days, number of rainfall days above 3 inches, and so on, and you get increases for all those. Okay, let's go on to hurricanes. Hurricanes, this is a beautiful picture of hurricane tracks, I think from 1949 in the Pacific, and from 1851 in the Atlantic, believe it or not. I guess we have some pretty amazing records. And the color is the strength of the hurricane. As you get more towards purple, it's stronger. On average, there's 4 to 16 storms a year. 1 to 7 of them would be like Category 3 or larger. And you can see that the tracks are all over the place, the various hurricane tracks. Hurricanes, it turns out, are pretty confusing to talk about. You can see here that the global mean surface temperature the global mean temperature of the Earth has changed over the time from 1880. The sea surface temperature looks like it's gotten warmer. The raw hurricane counts have been all over the place. It looks like there's a lot recently, but it's very difficult for us to say that for sure because you look at the blue boxes, but then look below at the red. Back in the 1800s, we didn't have satellites. We didn't have very good surveillance. So the adjusted one tries to take that into account. Makes it statistically difficult to say that we're having more hurricanes than we had in the distant past. Landfall is very noisy and there's nothing much you can say. So in the Atlantic, sea surface temperature looks warmer, although there's spots where it's colder recently in the 1980s, let's say. So here's our summary of what we think is going on with hurricanes, and it's going to be, we're going to need to play out the next decades to find out how good these are. But we know some things that we're pretty sure about. Tropical cyclone rainfall rates will increase 10 to 20% for 2 degrees of warming. So we can see that increase in Florence and Harvey. These are two famous hurricanes, Florence in North Carolina, Harvey in Houston, Texas, due to attribution studies. We expect tropical cyclone intensities will increase 1 to 10% for 2 degrees warming. These are based on models using sea surface temperatures now and in the past. Michael increased dramatically in wind speed, as I talked about later. One thing we should know is that each degree C adds 7% increase in wind speed, and damage on the ground increases dramatically with wind speed, more like wind speed squared, right? So it's really, wind speed can do a lot of damage. Most hurricane damage is due to rainfall, flooding, and so on, storm surge, all those things put together. But when you increase the wind, like Michael's wind speeds, you get a lot of wind damage. And in Michael, we had, not far from here, we had $1 billion possibly to logging, just the timber, trees twisted up, knocked down. And then we basically destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base, most of it, all the buildings on it, because of the wind speed, right? So you can get that kind of, wind speed can be very damaging. We expect the proportion of Category 4 and 5 storms could increase 50 to 80%. That means that there will be, if you look at the number of storms each year, while the number might go down, the storms will be stronger in proportion. Increased warming of the upper troposphere and increased vertical wind shear should reduce the number of tropical cyclones. So we don't know enough to estimate the reduction, but we kind of expect the number to go down. That has not happened yet. It's not been verified, but this is kind of an expectation. So while we might expect stronger ones, we might expect less in total. And because the sea level rise will go up, we should see more storm surge, even for tropical cyclones of a certain amount. You may recall what they called Superstorm Sandy, a hurricane that hit New Jersey, New York City area. Most of that damage was from storm surge that came in. So as you raise sea level, storm surge is a bigger problem. So hurricanes are very expensive propositions. And if we get more damage, now no one knows also, it's impossible to say with our current technology whether we would expect more hurricanes to come on land or not. That's just very difficult to say. This data here is something called the Actuaries Climate Index. There's actually a website, actuariesclimateindex.org, you can look at. People sell insurance and reinsurance. Reinsurance companies are basically there to insure insurance companies so that they can argue to state regulators that they have enough coverage to cover a problem that might occur in that state. And these companies have become aware that there is more climate risk than previously, and they are beginning to track that climate risk and use it to sort of think about the price of the insurance and the reinsurance. And this is an actuarial index. The reference period is 61 to 90, and just shows that based on observed indices related to 6 different components. These components are high and low temperatures, high winds, heavy precipitation, and drought, as well as changes in sea level. They put together an actuarial index that would estimate in some fashion how much damage might occur in the USA and Canada. So it's a very rough and ready index, but let me assure you that these companies are very involved in understanding their risk. They're betting, when they give you insurance, they're betting on you not using it. And they know that the climate is beginning to change that calculus. And so they're worried about that. This is climate change in agriculture. And basically what we have here is that temperature increases affect the way plants grow, not surprising. Heavy rain can leach nitrogen from the soil. It can also cause seeds to fail. And pathogens like blights and fungi increase with moisture. If you get too much moisture in a field over a long period of time, you can get fungus. Soil moisture content, you can lose it if temperatures are too high. When you get very high temperatures, you get a lot of evaporation and the soil becomes very dry. You can have increases in pest populations. We talked earlier about insects moving around. Insects' metabolisms run at the background temperature. So, you know, if you live in a colder climate in the fall, when it gets cold, the flies move very slowly. You can kill a fly a lot easier in September or October than you can in June and July, because the flies are a lot quicker because their metabolisms are higher. So if you get warming, we will have increased metabolism rates. Also, breeding can change. The breeding cycle can change. They breed more often. So you can get losses of crops. We already have losses of crops, but you can get increased losses of crops to increase in pests. Also, we often talk about how CO2 can increase food production because the CO2 concentration goes up. But when you grow plants under higher CO2 levels, you get less nutrients like proteins, iron, and zinc in the food stuff itself. So it might be that climate causes the Corn Belt to move slightly north. We may have to adapt with different hybrids and so on. But we will have to manage all this. It's a complicated process. Here's some ranges of plant growth. You notice that the purple are the ideal range for reproductive response. In other words, the range at which these plants will reproduce can be sometimes narrow in temperature and a little lower than the ideal range for growth. The ideal range for growth is at a higher temperature. So you can see for corn and soybeans, these ranges of plant growth where you do better or less well. And they're not, I mean, they're fairly broad, but they're not huge, right? So some adaptation may be necessary. And lastly, I just want to talk a bit about a few examples of adaptations that animal and plants are going through. And this is pine bark beetles. You may have heard about the pine bark beetles on the West Coast, right? Where they're attacking pine trees. This is on the East Coast. This is a picture of Long Island. The brown places are where the pine beetles have attached what are called pitch pines. There's a lot of P's in that sentence. So pine beetles and pitch pines. But the idea is that this is a map of pitch pine mortality and percent losses in different colors. The black being where lots of trees have, I'm sorry, the brown being where lots of trees have died. And this is a case where a study was done. In fact, go to the next slide here. This was a PhD thesis. And a study was done to look at air temperature on the coldest night and the estimated proportion of pine beetles that died. And basically what was happening, what they were able to do is to map the northern edge of the beetle range, which had been expanding. So it was heading towards Long Island as the temperature went up. So you'll notice here in this study, it says that 100% of the beetles die in the, so what they do is they put their larvae in a tree behind the bark, right? And then you go through the winter, and then in the spring, the larvae pop out as beetles and go through, do their little thing, and plant more larvae for the next season. Well, if the temperature goes down below minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit, 100% of the beetles, 100% of the larvae hidden away behind the bark dies. And you can see as the coldest night is warmer, up towards, for example, minus 1 degree Fahrenheit, you only get 60% of the beetles that, southern pine beetles that die. Well, air temperature, the northern edge of the coldest night temperature, colder than 14, has been moving 40 miles per decade north on the East Coast. It turns out that doing population surveys of the northern edge of the beetle range is expanding at about 53 miles per decade, roughly coincident, right? So basically this explains how those pine beetles got to suddenly attack the pitch pines on Long Island. A nice little bit of detective work, and shows the effect of the range of pests that threaten our ecosystems. Now the fish are also moving. This shows a North American example of economically important fish: American lobster, red hake, and black sea bass. They've all moved north by about 119 miles. You can see the colors here, the light end of the range of green, let's say, that's the black sea bass in 1968. The darker green is more recent measurements of their population density, where they are, and that's in 2015. You can see how they've moved north. Some have moved farther than others, of course. And you can see in the graphs below the average distance moved. They're also moving a little bit offshore to cooler water. And so if you stay fishing in the same place along the Atlantic, you see more southern fish moving into your zone, and you see other fish moving out of your zone. We're seeing the same thing in the Bering Sea. Pollock, snow crab, and halibut have moved away from the coast since the 1980s and northward by an average of 14 to 20 miles. The average center of biomass for 105 marine fish species have shifted northwards about 10 miles and moved to deeper waters by something like 20 feet deeper in the water. And this is all just because the temperature of the water has gone up as much as it has. And this is important because it means people travel further to fish. We're moving the fishing centers. Also, we expect an increase in the number of cases of vector-borne diseases. Now, there are many reasons why you would get an increase in vector-borne diseases. And some of that just has to do with new viruses that mutate, all that kind of thing. But what we're really talking about is more exposure, expanded geographical range, changes in the vector's behavior. A vector is like a mosquito or something like that. Increased duration of the warm season, and changes in precipitation. You know that mosquitoes are around if there's pools of water sitting around. for them to breed in. So those things are all brought on by climate change, which will have an effect. So, for example, about 68% of California will have an increased probability for West Nile virus by 2050. And if you just look at this graph, it shows the number of days that are suitable for disease transmission increases with inside this curve where mosquitoes are likely to spread that disease. So if you're the kind of place that's in the lower end of this temperature range, you have a certain number of days, and as you move to the right, you get the probability of more days. So for example, relative to 1970, the number of days in Tallahassee has gone up by 17 more days exposure, and in Portland, Maine, by 22 more days of transmission risk from mosquitoes. So what does, oh, one last thing, coral bleaching. Sorry, I left this out in my notes. I said earlier that one of the things is corals will have a harder time existing. In the past history, here's a graph from 1980 to 1999. Sea surface temperature is plotted. And you notice that the sea surface temperature, of course, goes up and down every year. So you get increases and decreases. When the increases go above a line that's on this graph, we have had what are called coral bleaching events. And what happens in those events is these little corals have algae that live in the corals, and if the temperature goes high enough, the algae are expelled from the corals, and the algae are, there's sort of a symbiotic relationship between the algae and the coral. The algae absorb sunlight and create energy that the coral uses, and the algae gets, the benefit is the algae gets protected by the corals, so the algae doesn't get eaten by fish because the corals are hard and it can hide in there. But when the temperature goes above a certain threshold, for some reason the coral ejects the algae, and because of the change, because there's no energy available, the coral bleaches, basically turns white. Now, these corals do recover over a period of 10 to 15 years if there's that much time between, you know, when the temperature goes back down, they tend to recover. But you can see if you look at those similar lines on these curves for corals in different areas, if you project the temperature into the future, at some point, the temperature will go across the threshold lines for algae rejection almost all the time. And so then the corals die for good, right? And don't come back. There are different sensitivities for different corals in different places. There are deep sea corals and more surface corals. And so this can be a more complicated argument one way or the other, but there's no question that a lot of the surface corals we see, the Great Barrier Reef and some of these other ones, are wonderful ecosystems, are severely threatened by this in the future. Okay, so what can we say in summary about all these changes? Well, there's a strong case for the reality of the climate effects listed above. Surely you want people to tell you about them, that there's a responsible way to, we need to responsibly continue to try and understand these things. There's no question they're complicated, so you can debate them. I think the other thing I would add is that some of these processes are more managed than others. The agricultural process, we can invent new plants, we can move farms, we can do things if we have time to adapt. Farmers have been adapting to weather and climate their whole lives, and they're good at it. So maybe there's things they can do, but it'll cost money, and it may end up with challenges. For example, coffee beans are grown in a very narrow range on the side of a mountain. Climate change may severely affect coffee, and there may not be an easy way to adapt. At least Arabica coffee, the best coffee, the best coffee we have. So we could also change our behavior. A lot of these projections I've talked about have been with the business as usual curve. And so we could step in and limit climate changes and thus limit the damage, right? So this is the challenge that we face. So this lecture 8 about what we're worried about has gone on for a bit. And that is not all we're worried about. I have lecture 9 is going to introduce the concept of tipping points, places where things we could run into that would create more of a discontinuous change in temperature. And we will get into that in the next lecture. Thank you so much for listening to lecture 8, and see you soon.